They dragged me from the altar by my arm, my mother's nails digging crescents into my skin while my brother blocked the church doors. The guests sat frozen, uncertain whether to intervene or pretend they saw nothing. My veil tore as Victoria yanked me backward, her whispered threats hissing against my ear like venom. "This is for your own good, Natalie. You don't know what you're doing." The organist's hands hovered above the keys, the melody dying mid-note. But Ethan didn't move. He stood at the end of the aisle, hands steady at his sides, watching my family unravel me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a woman making a choice. When our eyes met through the chaos, he smiled. Not the nervous grin of a man watching his wedding collapse, but something else entirely. Something calm and knowing and impossibly certain. Then he spoke, just loud enough for me to hear over my mother's frantic whispers. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm not who you think I am, Natalie. And neither are you." In that moment, with my dress bunched in my mother's fists and my brother's shadow blocking the summer light, everything I thought I knew about my life splintered into something new. Because the man I was about to marry had just told me a truth that would dismantle my family's lies, and I realized I'd been living in a story written by someone else. Like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't yet. The morning of my wedding started like a postcard. Pale gold light filtered through the curtains of the bridal suite at the Riverside estate, catching dust motes that drifted like tiny stars. Outside, the Willamette River curved through Portland's summer greenery, the water moving slow and silver beneath a cloudless sky. Claire had arrived early with coffee and croissants, her laugh filling the room as she helped me into my dress. "You look like you stepped out of a fairy tale," she said, fastening the last button at my spine. Her reflection grinned at me in the mirror, her dark hair swept into an elegant twist. I couldn't stop smiling. My cheeks ached from it. My dress was simple but perfect, ivory silk that moved like water, with delicate lace sleeves that brushed my wrists. No train, no veil that required 3 people to manage. Just me, about to marry the man who made me feel like coming home. Ethan Cross had walked into my life 2 years earlier at a community fundraiser for youth arts programs. I'd been setting up easels for the silent auction when he appeared beside me, rolling up his sleeves without asking, just stepping in to help. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, just worked side by side until he finally said, "You're really good at this. Organizing chaos, I mean." I'd laughed and told him it was a survival skill from growing up in the Harper household. He'd tilted his head, curious but not prying, and said, "Sounds like a story worth hearing." That curiosity never felt invasive. Ethan listened the way most people didn't, leaning forward slightly, asking questions that made me think rather than defend. He was a high school history teacher with a passion for helping kids see themselves in the past, and he spoke about his students the way other people spoke about family. There was a gentleness to him, a steadiness that felt rare. When he asked me to dinner a week later, I said yes without hesitation. My family didn't take the news well. Victoria, my mother, had pursed her lips when I first mentioned him over Sunday brunch at the Harper mansion. "A teacher," she repeated, the word landing like a stone. "That's very noble, Natalie. But what does he plan to do long term?" I'd bristled at the implication that teaching wasn't enough, that Ethan's work with kids who desperately needed someone to believe in them somehow diminished his worth. "He's building something meaningful," I said. "That matters to me." Dylan, my older brother, had been blunter. "You're settling, Nat. You could do better. This guy doesn't have the connections or the pedigree to fit into our world." Our world, as if it were a private club with velvet ropes and a bouncer checking credentials. I'd left that brunch early, Ethan waiting for me in his old sedan parked 2 blocks away because he refused to subject himself to valet judgment. "You okay?" he'd asked, reading my face before I'd even closed the door. I nodded, buckling my seatbelt. Let's go somewhere they'd never think to look for us. Over the next 2 years, I built a life with Ethan that existed in the margins of my family's expectations. We spent weekends hiking Forest Park, stopping at food carts for lunch, talking for hours about everything and nothing. He introduced me to his students' artwork, their essays, their dreams. I brought him into my work at a nonprofit focused on housing stability, where I coordinated outreach programs. We were building something quietly radical, a partnership rooted in respect rather than performance. When Ethan proposed, it wasn't grand or orchestrated for social media. We were sitting on his apartment balcony, watching the city lights blink on as dusk settled over the rooftops. He reached for my hand, his thumb tracing slow circles against my palm. "Natalie," he said, "I want to spend my life making sure you never have to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's idea of who you should be. Will you marry me?" The ring was simple, a single sapphire flanked by tiny diamonds. I cried, nodding through the tears, and we sat there until the stars came out. Telling my family was another matter. Victoria's reaction was immediate and cutting. "You're making a mistake, Natalie. This man is not your equal. He doesn't come from the right background. You'll regret this." Dylan had crossed his arms, shaking his head like I was a child refusing to eat vegetables. "You're being impulsive. You barely know him. What's the rush?" Even my father, Robert, who usually stayed neutral in family storms, had cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart? Maybe take some more time to think it through." But I was sure. Surer than I'd ever been about anything. So I set a date, booked the Riverside estate, and moved forward. My family's disapproval simmered in the background, occasionally bubbling over in pointed comments during dinners I felt obligated to attend. Claire was my anchor through it all, reminding me that their opinions didn't get a vote in my happiness. "If they can't see how good he is for you," she said one night over wine, "that's their loss, not yours." The weeks leading up to the wedding were a strange mix of joy and tension. Ethan and I addressed invitations together at his kitchen table, laughing over his terrible handwriting. We tasted cakes, chose flowers, debated whether to have a DJ or a string quartet. His mother, Catherine, was warm and welcoming, already treating me like family. His father, William, was quieter but kind, often slipping me pieces of advice about handling Ethan's stubborn streak. "You'll need patience," he'd said with a wink. He gets that from his mother. But my family's silence was deafening. Victoria RSVP'd with a curt yes, no added note or well wishes. Dylan didn't respond at all until I called him directly. "Yeah, I'll be there," he'd said, his tone flat. Someone has to represent the family properly, the barb stung, but I let it go. I wasn't going to let their bitterness infect my happiness. The night before the wedding, Ethan and I broke tradition and had dinner together. We sat at a corner table in Harborview Restaurant, the city glittering below us through floor-to-ceiling windows. He reached across the table, his fingers lacing through mine. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "everything changes. You ready?" I nodded, squeezing his hand. More than ready. But there was something in his expression, a flicker of hesitation that I couldn't quite read. "Are you okay?" I asked. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just thinking about how much I love you. How much I want to protect you from anything that could hurt you." It felt like an odd thing to say the night before our wedding, but I dismissed it as nerves. Everyone gets emotional before big life changes. We finished our meal, walked along the waterfront until the air turned cool, and he kissed me goodnight outside my apartment. "See you at the altar," he whispered. I watched him drive away, the taillights disappearing into the night. Now, standing in the bridal suite with Claire adjusting my veil, that moment replayed in my mind. "I want to protect you from anything that could hurt you." The words felt heavier now, weighted with something I hadn't understood then. Claire caught my expression in the mirror. "Cold feet?" she asked, her tone teasing but gentle. I shook my head. "No. Just thinking." She squeezed my shoulders. "Then stop thinking and start celebrating. You're about to marry the love of your life." The ceremony was set to begin at 4 in the afternoon. Guests trickled into the estate's garden chapel, a stone structure with open sides that let the breeze carry the scent of roses and jasmine. I peeked through the doorway and saw Ethan's students filling the back rows, young faces bright with excitement. His colleagues sat near the front, smiling and chatting. Catherine dabbed her eyes with a tissue, already emotional. But on the other side of the aisle, my family sat rigid and separate. Victoria wore black, her face a mask of disapproval. Dylan checked his phone, barely glancing up. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The contrast was stark. On one side, people who celebrated us. On the other, people who had come to witness what they considered a mistake. Claire must have seen it too because she leaned close and whispered, "Ignore them. Focus on Ethan. Focus on you." I nodded, taking a deep breath. The organist began the prelude, and I felt my pulse quicken. Then everything shattered. I was supposed to walk down the aisle in 5 minutes. The coordinator had just signaled that it was time to line up. Claire was smoothing my veil one last time when the door to the bridal suite burst open. Victoria stood in the doorway, Dylan just behind her, their faces twisted with something between fury and panic. "Natalie," my mother said, her voice sharp and commanding. "We need to talk. Now." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Claire stepped between us instinctively. "The ceremony is about to start. Whatever this is, it can wait." Victoria's eyes flashed. "No, it absolutely cannot wait. Natalie, you need to come with us right now." My stomach dropped. The intensity in her voice was alarming, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Mom, I'm getting married in 5 minutes. Whatever you want to say can happen after." Dylan moved closer, his expression hard. "You don't understand, Nat. We've been trying to tell you for weeks. You're making a huge mistake. This guy isn't who he says he is." The words hung in the air, absurd and melodramatic. I almost laughed. "What are you talking about? He's a teacher. You've met him. You know exactly who he is." Victoria's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "No, we don't. And neither do you. Natalie, please. If you go through with this, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." There was something desperate in her voice, something I'd never heard before. It made my skin prickle. But I also knew my mother. I knew how she manipulated situations to maintain control, how she weaponized fear to keep me tethered to her vision of my life. I straightened my spine, meeting her gaze. "I'm marrying Ethan. If you can't support that, you're welcome to leave." Her face went pale, then flushed red. Dylan grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "You're not listening. We're not letting you do this." Claire shoved his hand away. "Get out. Both of you. Now." But they didn't leave. Instead, Victoria lunged forward, grabbing my other arm, and suddenly I was being pulled toward the door. I stumbled, my heel catching on the hem of my dress. Claire was shouting, trying to pry my mother's fingers loose. The coordinator appeared, her face shocked, calling for someone to help. But Dylan blocked the doorway, his body a wall. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. I was dragged through the hallway, my veil tearing on a doorframe, my mother's nails cutting into my skin. "Stop," I kept saying, my voice rising. "Stop it. Let go of me." But they didn't stop. They pulled me toward the chapel entrance, into the view of the guests. The music faltered. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Ethan stood at the altar, his best man Marcus beside him. When he saw us, his expression shifted, something dark and determined settling over his features. He started walking toward us, his steps measured and deliberate. My mother's voice was in my ear, frantic and shrill. "You don't know him, Natalie. You don't know what he's hiding. This marriage cannot happen." I tried to wrench free, but Dylan's hand clamped down on my shoulder, holding me in place. The guests were standing now, uncertain and uncomfortable. Some looked away. Others pulled out phones. And then Ethan was there, standing just a few feet away, his gaze locked on mine. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of us, despite the hands restraining me, despite the crowd watching. "I'm not who you think I am, Natalie," he said, his voice steady and calm. "And neither are you." The words cut through the noise, through my mother's threats and my brother's grip. I froze, staring at him. "What does that mean?" I whispered. Ethan took a step closer, ignoring Victoria's sharp command to stay back. "It means your family has been lying to you your entire life. And I can prove it." The silence that followed Ethan's words was suffocating. My mother's grip on my arm loosened slightly, her fingers trembling against my skin. Dylan's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath the surface. The guests remained standing, a collective held breath waiting to see what would happen next. I felt the world tilt sideways, everything I thought I understood about this moment suddenly uncertain. "What are you talking about?" I managed to say, my voice barely audible over the blood rushing in my ears. Ethan's eyes never left mine, and in them I saw something I'd never noticed before. Not deception exactly, but a depth I hadn't fully explored. A story he'd been carrying that he was finally ready to tell. "Your mother and brother have spent the last 2 months trying to convince you I'm not good enough for you," he said, his voice carrying across the chapel with surprising authority. "They've told you I don't have the right connections, the right background, the right pedigree. They've made you doubt whether choosing me was choosing down." Victoria's face flushed crimson. "This is not the time or place for whatever theatrics you think you're staging. Natalie, we're leaving. Now." But I wasn't moving. Something in Ethan's tone, in the way he stood there completely unshaken by the chaos around us, made me stay rooted to the spot. My family had been acting strange for months, their opposition to my marriage escalating from disapproval to something closer to panic. I'd attributed it to snobbery, to their obsession with maintaining the Harper family image. But the desperation in my mother's voice when she'd burst into the bridal suite suggested something else entirely. "Tell me," I said to Ethan, ignoring my mother's sharp intake of breath. "Tell me what you mean." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When he unfolded it, I could see it was old, the edges yellowed with age, creases worn soft from being opened and closed many times. "This," he said, holding it up so I could see, "is a birth certificate. Mine, to be specific. The one my parents kept hidden until I was old enough to understand why." Marcus, his best man, moved to stand beside him, a silent show of support. Claire had finally managed to pull herself free from the tangle of bodies near the door and came to stand next to me, her hand finding mine. "Whatever you need," she whispered. "I'm right here." Ethan took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer but no less clear. "My name isn't Ethan Cross. Well, it is now, legally. But I was born Ethan Harper. Your cousin. Your family's secret shame." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, ripples spreading outward in waves of confusion and shock. I heard gasps from the guests, murmurs rising like a tide. My mother made a sound somewhere between a sob and a growl, her hand flying to her mouth. Dylan swore under his breath, his face now sheet white. And I just stood there, my brain struggling to process what I just heard. "That's impossible," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, pieces were already clicking into place with sickening clarity. Memories I'd dismissed, fragments of conversations I'd overheard as a child, the way my parents always changed the subject when I asked about extended family. "We don't have cousins. Dad was an only child, and Mom's sister died before I was born." "Your mother's sister didn't die," Ethan said gently, his eyes full of an aching sympathy. "She was disowned. Cut off completely when she got pregnant at 19 by a man your grandparents didn't approve of. They told everyone she'd died in a car accident, held a fake funeral, the whole performance. Meanwhile, she was living 3 hours away in Eugene, working 2 jobs to raise me alone." Victoria finally found her voice, shrill and desperate. "This is slander. This is a malicious lie designed to manipulate my daughter. Natalie, don't listen to him. He's clearly disturbed, and we need to get you away from him immediately." But I wasn't looking at my mother anymore. I was staring at Ethan, at this man I'd fallen in love with, searching his face for the truth. "How long have you known?" I asked. "That I was your cousin. That we were family." He didn't flinch from the question. "I found out 8 months ago. My mother, and Harper, she died last year. Before she passed, she told me everything. About the family that threw her away, about the life she should have had. She made me promise I'd find out the truth, document it, make sure the story wasn't buried with her." 8 months, I repeated, the timeline spinning through my mind. We'd been engaged for 10 months. Which meant he'd known almost our entire engagement. The betrayal of it hit me like a physical blow, my chest tightening until I couldn't breathe properly. "You knew, and you didn't tell me." "I wanted to," he said, and there was real pain in his voice now. "God, Natalie, I wanted to tell you every single day. But I needed to be sure first. I needed proof that couldn't be disputed or dismissed. So I hired an investigator. I tracked down records, interviewed people who knew my mother before she was erased. I built a case." Marcus cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly. "I've seen the evidence. Documents, photographs, witness statements. It's all legitimate. Ethan isn't lying about who he is." Dylan finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. "Even if this insane story were true, it doesn't change anything. You pursued Natalie knowing you were related. That's sick. That's predatory." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I didn't pursue anyone. We met by accident at a fundraiser. I had no idea who she was, no idea the woman helping set up easels was the daughter of the family that destroyed my mother's life. I didn't learn her last name until our 3rd date, and even then, Harper is common enough that I didn't make the connection immediately." "When did you figure it out?" I asked, my voice hollow. "When did you realize who I was?" "About 6 weeks after we started dating. I saw a photo at your apartment, a family portrait from when you were a teenager. Your mother was in it, and I recognized her face. My mom kept one picture, just one, hidden in a shoebox. It was her and your mother as teenagers, before everything fell apart. The resemblance was unmistakable." The chapel was completely silent now except for the distant sound of the river and the wind moving through the trees outside. I felt like I was floating above my body, watching this scene unfold from somewhere far away. This man I loved, who'd made me feel seen and valued in ways no one else ever had, was telling me he was my cousin. That our relationship was built on a foundation of secrets and lies, even if unintentional ones at first. "Why didn't you end it then?" I asked. "When you realized who I was, why didn't you just walk away?" "Because I'd already fallen in love with you," he said simply. "And because the more I learned about your family, about how they'd treated my mother and how they were treating you, the more I realized you deserved to know the truth. You deserved to understand that the people who raised you to believe you owed them everything were the same people who threw away a pregnant teenager because she didn't fit their image." Victoria was crying now, mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark streaks. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "We did what we had to do. And made her choice, and it wasn't our responsibility to clean up her mess. She could have given the baby up for adoption. She could have done the sensible thing. But she insisted on keeping it, on embarrassing the family." "Keeping it," Ethan repeated, his voice sharp for the first time. "You mean keeping me?" "I was the embarrassment. A child who didn't deserve to exist because my father wasn't wealthy enough, connected enough, good enough for the Harper standards." Claire's hand squeezed mine so hard it hurt, but the pain was grounding, reminding me I was still present in my body, still standing in my wedding dress in front of 100 witnesses while my life unraveled. The coordinator had disappeared, probably calling security or the police or both. Some of the guests had started to leave, uncomfortable with the intimate family drama playing out before them. But Ethan's students remained, watching their teacher with expressions of fierce loyalty. My father, Robert, who had been silent through all of this, finally stood from his seat in the front row. His face was gray, his hands shaking as he gripped the back of the pew in front of him. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely carrying. Victoria, is this boy really Anne's son? My mother turned to him, her expression wild. It doesn't matter. Don't you see? He manipulated Natalie. He wormed his way into her life to get revenge on us. This entire relationship has been a lie designed to hurt our family. Actually, Ethan said, reaching into his pocket again and pulling out a thick manila envelope, this entire relationship has been real. What's been a lie is the story you've told about who you are, who this family is. And I have proof. He held the envelope toward me, not my parents, not the crowd, but me. Inside here is everything. Birth certificates, letters my mother saved, photographs, medical records showing her injuries from when your grandfather hit her for refusing to get an abortion. Testimony from neighbors who witnessed the Harper family erasing and from existence. And DNA results, because I wanted to make absolutely certain before I said any of this publicly. My hands trembled as I took the envelope from him. It was heavy, substantial, full of a history I'd never known existed. You had our DNA tested, I said. When? Remember when we went to that health fair 6 months ago, the one at the community center? They were offering free genetic screening for hereditary conditions. You did it, so I did too. I kept my sample and paid for a private familial match analysis. The memory came back to me, hazy and unimportant at the time. We'd gotten our cheeks swabbed, laughed about what random health information we might discover, and gone out for Thai food afterward. I'd never thought about it again. But Ethan had. Ethan had taken that moment and turned it into evidence. So we're actually related, I said, the words tasting strange in my mouth. We're cousins. Second cousins, technically. My mother was your mother's half-sister. Same father, different mothers. Your grandfather had an affair in his 20s, got a woman pregnant, and married her when his first wife found out. And was the product of that marriage. So yes, we share DNA, but we're not as closely related as you might think. Dylan made a sound of disgust. This is insane. You're trying to justify staying in a relationship with your cousin by claiming it's distant enough not to matter? What kind of twisted logic is that? I'm not trying to justify anything, Ethan shot back. I'm giving Natalie information she deserves to have. Information you and your mother have spent decades hiding because it didn't fit the perfect Harper family narrative. My mother lived in poverty while you all summered in Cape Cod. She worked herself to exhaustion while you attended private schools and country clubs. And when she died, alone in a hospice because she couldn't afford better care, not one of you came to say goodbye. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and fast, blurring my vision. The weight of what I was learning, of what had been kept from me, pressed down until I thought my knees might buckle. Claire's arm went around my waist, holding me upright. The envelope in my hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Catherine, Ethan's mother, had risen from her seat and was making her way toward us. Her face was streaked with tears, but there was steel in her spine as she moved. She stopped in front of Victoria, and for a long moment, the two women just stared at each other. I knew Anne, Catherine said quietly. We were neighbors in Eugene. I watched her work herself sick trying to provide for Ethan, always wondering why his family never helped. She told me once that she'd been orphaned young, that she had no one. I believed her because why would a mother lie about something like that? Victoria's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Catherine turned to me, her expression softening. Your young man came to me 3 months ago and told me everything. Showed me the evidence. Asked for my advice about what to do. I told him the truth is always better than a lie, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. The guests who remained were completely transfixed now, this drama more compelling than any ceremony could have been. I could see phones out, recording, though some part of me that still cared about appearances wanted to scream at them to put the devices away. But what did appearances matter anymore? My entire life had been an appearance, a carefully constructed facade my family had built and maintained through lies and erasures. I need air, I said suddenly, my voice cracking. I need to get out of here. I turned toward the chapel doors, still holding the envelope, my ruined veil trailing behind me. Claire moved with me immediately, her arms still supporting my weight. Ethan took a step as if to follow, but I held up my hand. Don't. Please. I just need a minute. He stopped, respecting the boundary even as his face showed how much he wanted to come after me. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder, holding him back. I stumbled out of the chapel into the late afternoon sun, the lights suddenly too bright, too harsh. The gardens of the riverside estate stretched out before me, achingly beautiful and completely wrong for this moment. I made it to a stone bench near the river before my legs gave out. Claire sat beside me, saying nothing, just being present while I tried to remember how to breathe. The envelope sat in my lap, this Pandora's box of family secrets that I wasn't sure I was ready to open. But I also knew I couldn't not open it. Whatever was inside had shaped my entire existence, and I deserved to know the truth. With shaking hands, I broke the seal and pulled out the contents. The first thing I saw was a photograph, old and faded, showing two young women with their arms around each other, laughing at something outside the frame. One of them was unmistakably my mother, probably 16 or 17, her hair longer than she wore it now but her smile the same. The other girl looked enough like her to be a sister, with the same sharp cheekbones and wide-set eyes. Anne, I whispered. This is Anne. Claire leaned closer to look. She looks happy. They both do. I stared at the photo, at this evidence of a relationship I'd never known existed. My mother had a sister. I had an aunt. And neither of them had ever told me. Beneath the photo were documents. A birth certificate for Anne Marie Harper, born to Jonathan Harper and Elizabeth Chin. My grandfather's name. A hospital record from when Anne was 17, treated for a broken wrist and bruised ribs, the notes indicating possible domestic violence but no charges filed. Letters, dozens of them, written in a careful script that grew more desperate with each page. Please, just talk to me. I'm sorry I disappointed you, but I can't give up my baby. This child is innocent. Don't punish him for my mistakes. The letters stopped abruptly, and the next document was a death certificate. Anne Marie Harper, deceased. Except it wasn't a real death certificate, I realized as I looked closer. It was a fabrication, a forgery created to give the family a narrative they could control. Anne wasn't dead when this was filed. She was very much alive, pregnant and alone, erased so thoroughly that everyone believed she'd ceased to exist. There were more photos. Anne holding a newborn baby with dark hair and serious eyes. And a small boy building a sandcastle at what looked like a public beach. And in her late 30s, thinner than she should be, standing outside a small apartment building, her smile tired but genuine. And then, near the end of the stack, a photo that made my heart stop. It was taken at a park, maybe 5 years ago based on the date stamp. Anne sat on a bench, her hair gray now, her face lined with age and hardship. But it was the child beside her, a little girl maybe 7 years old with ribbons in her dark hair, that made me gasp. I knew that park. It was in Portland, just a few miles from my apartment. And I knew that day because I'd been there too. I remembered it suddenly with startling clarity. I'd been jogging through the park on a Saturday morning and had stopped to catch my breath near the playground. There had been a woman and a child on a bench, and the woman had smiled at me as I stretched. I'd smiled back, brief and meaningless, and continued my run. I'd given them no thought afterward, just another moment in another day. But it hadn't been meaningless. That woman had been my aunt. The boy must have been Ethan, already in his 20s by then but looking young enough to pass for a teenager from a distance. And they'd been in Portland, so close to where I lived, where my family lived, watching from the edges of a world they'd been barred from. Did she know who I was? I asked Claire, my voice breaking. Did she see me and recognize me? Claire took the photo gently from my hands, studying it. I don't know, she said softly. But maybe that's what Ethan meant. Maybe Anne came to Portland to see her family from afar. To glimpse the life that could have been hers. The thought was unbearable. This woman, my aunt, living in poverty and obscurity, reduced to stealing glimpses of the family that had thrown her away. And I jogged past her without a second glance, completely unaware that I was looking at my own blood. I sat on that bench for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the envelope's contents spread across my lap like evidence at a trial. Claire remained silent beside me, her presence the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the river in shades of amber and rose, beautiful and indifferent to the wreckage of my wedding day. Behind me, I could hear voices drifting from the chapel. The low rumble of my father's voice, sharp and defensive. My mother's higher pitch, oscillating between fury and something that sounded like fear. And underneath it all, Ethan's steady tone, still explaining, still defending, still trying to make them understand something they'd spent decades refusing to acknowledge. I should go back, I said, though I made no move to stand. I should hear the rest of whatever he has to say. Claire nodded slowly. Do you want to hear it? Or do you already know everything you need to know? The question hung between us. What did I need to know? The facts were clear enough from the documents in my hands. My mother had a sister she'd helped destroy. That sister had a son who became the man I fell in love with. Our relationship, while not illegal, was built on a foundation he'd known about and I hadn't. The betrayal of that secret sat heavy in my chest, even as I understood why he'd kept it. I need to know why, I said finally. Why he stayed after he found out. Why he let us get this far. Why today, of all days, he chose to tell the truth. Then let's go find out, Claire said, standing and offering me her hand. Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone. We walked back toward the chapel, my torn veil abandoned on the bench behind us. As we approached, I could see that most of the guests had dispersed, leaving only family members and a few of Ethan's closest friends. Marcus stood near the entrance, his expression guarded, and when he saw me, he straightened as if preparing for battle. She's coming back, he called over his shoulder. Ethan appeared in the doorway immediately, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. When our eyes met, I saw relief flash across his features before it was quickly replaced with caution. He wasn't sure what my return meant, whether I was coming back to hear more or to end things completely. I held up the envelope. I read it. All of it. My voice was steadier than I felt. Now I want to hear from you directly. No more documents, no more evidence. Just you telling me, in your own words, why you did this. He nodded, stepping aside to let me pass. Inside the chapel, the space felt cavernous and strange with so few people remaining. My parents sat in the front pew, my mother's face buried in her hands while my father stared straight ahead at nothing. Dylan leaned against a pillar, his arms crossed and his expression hostile. Catherine and William sat together on the opposite side, their faces kind but serious. I walked to the center of the aisle, the same path I should have taken as a bride hours ago, and turned to face Ethan. He stood at the altar where he'd waited for me, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the distance that had opened between us. Start from the beginning, I said. From the moment you knew who I was. Tell me everything. He took a breath, his hands clasping together in front of him like he was steadying himself. When I saw that photo at your apartment, the one of your family at Christmas, I knew immediately. Your mother's face, it was older but unmistakable from the picture my mom had kept. I went home that night and pulled out every document my mother had given me before she died. Birth certificates, letters, everything. I stayed up until dawn matching dates and names, building a family tree on my apartment floor. And then what? I prompted when he paused. You confirmed we were related, and then you just kept dating me? His jaw tightened. No. I broke up with you. Remember? 3 days after I saw that photo, I told you I needed space, that things were moving too fast. You were hurt, confused. You asked me what you'd done wrong, and I couldn't tell you the truth because I didn't know how to explain that the problem wasn't you, it was me. It was everything. I did remember. The breakup had come out of nowhere, sudden and painful. We'd been together for 2 months, just starting to feel like a real couple, and then he'd pulled away without explanation. I'd spent a week convinced I'd misread everything between us, that whatever connection I'd felt had been one-sided. And then, just as suddenly, he'd come back. "But you changed your mind," I said. 2 weeks later, you showed up at my office with coffee and asked if we could talk. Because I spent those 2 weeks researching everything I could about your family, about Anne, about what really happened. And the more I learned, the more I realized that walking away from you meant letting your family win. It meant allowing them to control both our lives, to decide who deserved love and who didn't based on their arbitrary rules about bloodlines and social standing. Dylan pushed off from the pillar, his voice cutting. "So this was about revenge. You stayed with my sister to get back at us for what happened to your mother." Ethan's gaze shifted to my brother, cold and unyielding. "No. I stayed because I fell in love with Natalie before I knew who she was, and that love didn't stop just because I discovered we shared some DNA. I stayed because she deserved better than the family she'd been born into, and I thought maybe I could help her see that." Victoria finally raised her head, her face blotchy and aged in the fading light. "You manipulated her. You knew this information would destroy her relationship with us, and you used it as a weapon." "I didn't destroy anything," Ethan said quietly. "You did that yourselves 30 years ago when you chose image over family. When you decided a pregnant teenager was disposable. All I did was bring the truth into the light." "But why now?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since this all began. "Why tell me today, in front of everyone? You had 8 months. You could have told me in private, given me time to process this before we got to the altar. Instead, you waited until my family was physically dragging me away from our wedding to drop this bomb. Why?" Something shifted in his expression, a flash of pain mixed with determination. "Because they didn't give me a choice. 3 weeks ago, your mother contacted me. She knew. I don't know how she found out, whether she hired someone to investigate me or whether she finally put the pieces together herself, but she knew who I was. And she threatened me." My head snapped toward Victoria, whose face had gone white. "You knew? For 3 weeks, you knew, and you said nothing to me?" "I was trying to protect you," she said, her voice thin and desperate. "This man is dangerous, Natalie. He's been lying to you from the start, manipulating you into falling in love with him. When I confronted him, he admitted everything. Admitted he'd known about the connection for months and deliberately pursued you anyway." "That's not how that conversation went," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "You called me and told me you knew who I was. You said if I didn't end the engagement and leave Portland immediately, you'd make sure everyone in this city knew I was a predator who'd seduced his own cousin. You threatened to destroy my career, have me fired from the school, ruin any chance I had at a normal life." The chapel fell silent except for the sound of my mother's sharp breathing. I stared at her, this woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me about propriety and family loyalty and doing the right thing. And she'd been willing to destroy an innocent man to maintain her secrets. "Is that true?" I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you threaten him?" She lifted her chin, defiant even now. "I did what any mother would do to protect her child from a predator." "I'm not a predator," Ethan said, each word precise and controlled. "I'm someone who fell in love honestly and then had to navigate an impossible situation when I learned the truth. I hired lawyers to make sure what we were doing wasn't illegal. I consulted with geneticists about the actual risks of a relationship between second cousins, which by the way are negligible. I tried to do everything right." "Then why not just tell me?" I demanded, my composure finally cracking. "Why all the secrecy? Why make me fall deeper in love with you while holding on to this massive secret?" "Because I was afraid," he said simply. "Afraid you'd look at me differently. Afraid you'd believe your family's version of events instead of the truth. Afraid I'd lose you before you had a chance to understand what really happened to Anne, to see your family for what they really are." "And what are we?" My father spoke for the first time, his voice rough with emotion. "What exactly do you think we are?" Ethan turned to face Robert fully. "You're people who value appearance over substance. Who would rather erase a family member than deal with the embarrassment of her choices. Who raised Natalie to believe her worth was tied to meeting your impossible standards, just like you did to Anne. The only difference is Natalie is strong enough to break free. You don't know anything about us, Dylan spat. You don't know what it was like, what Ann put us through. The scandal, the gossip, the way it affected our father's business and our mother's standing in the community. Catherine stood abruptly, her voice ringing clear across the chapel. I know what Ann put you through. She told me everything before she died. How your father gave her a black eye when she refused to terminate her pregnancy. How your mother locked her in her room for 3 days without food trying to force a miscarriage. How when she finally escaped with nothing but the clothes on her back, not one of you tried to find her or help her. You speak of scandal and gossip like they matter more than a child's life. My mother was on her feet now too, her voice shrill. And was given choices. She could have done things properly, could have given the baby up for adoption and returned to the family. Instead, she chose to keep it, chose to drag our name through the mud. She chose to keep me, Ethan said, his voice breaking for the first time. She chose to love me even when it cost her everything. Even when she had to work 3 jobs and skip meals so I could eat. Even when she developed heart problems from the stress and couldn't afford proper treatment. She chose me over everything, and you speak about it like she was the villain in this story. Tears were streaming down my face again, but they felt different now. Not tears of confusion or betrayal, but of grief for a woman I never got to know. An aunt who had suffered in ways I couldn't fully comprehend, who had loved her son enough to sacrifice everything, while the family I'd trusted had erased her existence like she never mattered. I turned to my mother, really looking at her for the first time. You told me she died in a car accident. I was 12 years old, and I cried for days over an aunt I never met. You held me while I grieved, told me how much she would have loved me. And it was all a lie. Victoria's face crumpled. We thought it was kinder. Better for you to mourn someone who never existed than to know the truth about what she did to this family. What she did, I repeated, the words tasting bitter. You mean getting pregnant? Refusing to terminate? Choosing to be a mother? Those are her crimes? She chose a nobody over her family, Dylan interjected. Some guy with no prospects, no education, no future. She threw away everything we could have given her for what? A life of poverty and struggle? She chose love, I said, the realization hitting me with startling clarity. She chose the same thing I was trying to choose today. The same thing you've spent months trying to talk me out of. You see Ethan as beneath us the same way your parents saw Ann's partner as beneath them. Nothing has changed. You're still the same people who would rather destroy someone than admit your standards are cruel. The silence that followed was deafening. My father had his head in his hands now, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs. My mother stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing but no words emerging. And Dylan just stared at me like I'd become a stranger. Catherine approached me carefully, as if afraid I might bolt. She held out a small leather journal, worn and creased. And kept diaries her whole life. This one covers the years from when she got pregnant until Ethan was 5. I think you should have it. I think you should know her story in her own words. I took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was soft with age, and when I opened it, Anne's handwriting sprawled across the pages, sometimes neat and controlled, sometimes barely legible with emotion. The first entry was dated 32 years ago. They told me today that I'm no longer their daughter. That the baby growing inside me makes me dead to them. Mother wouldn't even look at me. Father called me a whore. Only Victoria cried, but she didn't fight for me. She never fights for anything that might cost her something. I looked up at my mother. She called you by name. She knew you wouldn't help her, even then. Victoria's face twisted with anguish. I was 17. What was I supposed to do? Go against our parents? Throw away my own future for her mistakes? You were supposed to love her, I said, my voice breaking. She was your sister. Your family. And you let them destroy her because it was easier than standing up for what was right. I kept reading, flipping through entries that detailed Anne's struggles. Finding a job while visibly pregnant. Dealing with landlords who didn't want to rent to a single mother. The fear when Ethan spiked a fever at 2 months old and she had to choose between taking him to the emergency room and making rent. The small joys too, his first laugh, his first steps, the way he would reach for her face with chubby hands and make her feel like maybe everything would be okay. And threaded through it all, mentions of the family she'd lost. Saw Victoria at the grocery store today. She looked right through me like I wasn't there. Our father's company was featured in the newspaper. He's richer than ever while I'm eating ramen for the 3rd night in a row. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, but then Ethan smiles and I know I did. He's worth everything I lost and more. I closed the journal, unable to read anymore without completely breaking down. This woman had loved her son with a fierceness I could feel radiating off the pages. She'd endured poverty and isolation and heartbreak, and through it all, she'd never regretted choosing him. The contrast to my own family's conditional love was devastating. Ethan had been watching me read, his expression guarded but hopeful. When I looked up at him, he spoke softly. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to choose me despite being your cousin. I told you because I wanted you to understand that the family you've been trying so hard to please will never think you're good enough. The same way they convinced themselves and wasn't good enough. The same way they've spent your whole life making you feel like you have to earn their love. Is that true? I asked him, my voice small. Have they been doing that to me? He took a step closer, his hands hanging loose at his sides like he wanted to reach for me but wasn't sure if he was allowed. You've spent your entire adult life trying to make them proud. Working at a non-profit instead of the corporate job they wanted. Living modestly instead of moving into one of their investment properties. Choosing me instead of the lawyer or businessman they kept setting you up with. And every time you made a choice for yourself, they acted like you were betraying them. I thought about the years of subtle criticism, the disappointed sighs, the way they made me feel selfish for wanting my own life. The way my mother would compare me to Dylan's wife, who'd given up her career to focus on family and charity work. The way my father would mention, just casually, when he ran into the son of a business partner who was single and very successful. The 1,000 small ways they'd tried to shape me into their image of who I should be. Claire, who had been standing quietly near the entrance, finally spoke. I've watched them do it for years, Nat. Every time we made plans and you canceled because your mom needed you at some society function. Every time you apologized for not being what they wanted. I tried to tell you, but you weren't ready to hear it. I wasn't ready, I agreed. I wanted to believe they loved me the way parents should love their children. Unconditionally. Wholly. But they don't, do they? Their love comes with terms and conditions, and I've been scrambling to meet them my whole life. My mother made a broken sound, stepping toward me with her hands outstretched. That's not fair, Natalie. Everything we've done has been because we love you. Because we want what's best for you. No, I said, my voice growing stronger. You want what makes you look good. What fits your idea of the perfect family. The same way you wanted it with Anne, and when she wouldn't comply, you erased her. You would have done the same to me eventually if I'd kept choosing wrong. The truth of it settled over the chapel like winter frost. My family didn't know how to love without control, without conditions. They'd proven it with Anne, and they'd been proving it with me for years. I'd just been too caught up in trying to earn their approval to see it clearly. I turned back to Ethan, this man who had carried the weight of a devastating secret for months while loving me through it. The anger I'd felt at his deception was still there, simmering beneath my ribs, but it was tempered now by understanding. He'd been trapped between impossible choices, and in the end, he'd chosen truth over comfort. He'd chosen to give me information my family had spent decades hiding, even knowing it might cost him everything. I need time, I said finally, my voice steady despite the chaos raging inside me. I need to process all of this away from here, away from everyone. I can't make any decisions right now about us, about them, about anything. Ethan nodded immediately, relief and resignation warring on his face. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. Dylan pushed off from the pillar, his voice sharp with accusation. So that's it? You're just going to walk away from your family because some stranger filled your head with lies? He's not a stranger, I said, my gaze never leaving Ethan's face. He's family. He's more family than any of you have been to me in years. You just never wanted me to know it. My father finally raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Natalie, please. Don't do this. Don't throw away everything we've built together over something that happened before you were born. What you built was a fiction, I replied, turning to look at him fully. A beautiful, pristine fiction where difficult truths got buried and inconvenient people disappeared. And disappeared. And if I'd kept resisting your plans for my life, eventually you would have found a way to make me disappear too. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. You would have cut me off the same way you cut her off, and you would have told yourselves it was for my own good. The accuracy of my words registered on his face, a flinch of recognition he couldn't quite hide. My mother reached for my father's hand, clinging to him like a lifeline, and for the first time I saw them clearly. Not as the powerful, put-together couple who commanded respect in every room they entered, but as two frightened people who'd built their entire existence on maintaining appearances. They'd sacrificed and to keep their image intact, and they'd been prepared to sacrifice me too. I walked toward the chapel doors, my ruined dress trailing behind me. Claire fell into step beside me immediately, her presence a silent promise that I wouldn't face whatever came next alone. As I reached the threshold, I paused and looked back one last time. Ethan stood at the altar still, Marcus beside him, looking like a groom who'd just watched his wedding implode. My parents sat hunched together in the front pew, smaller somehow than I'd ever seen them. Dylan remained by the pillar, his face a mask of anger and confusion. For what it's worth, I said, my voice carrying across the empty space, I'm sorry and didn't have anyone to fight for her. I'm sorry she spent her life alone and struggling while you all pretended she never existed. And I'm sorry I didn't know her, because from everything I've learned today, she sounds like she was the best person in this family. Then I walked out into the evening air, leaving behind the wedding that never was and the family that never really knew me. Claire drove me back to my apartment in silence, understanding that I needed the quiet to think. The city passed by the windows in a blur of lights and movement, people going about their normal Tuesday evenings while my entire world had shifted on its axis. When we pulled up outside my building, Claire finally spoke. Do you want me to come up? Or do you need to be alone? Come up, I said immediately. I don't trust myself to be alone right now. I might do something rash like burn all my family photos or block everyone's numbers. We'd wait until tomorrow for the blocking, she said with a small smile. Tonight we just survive. My apartment felt foreign when we walked in, like I'd been gone for months instead of hours. The wedding outfit I'd planned to change into after the reception still hung on the bedroom door. The gift bags I'd prepared for the bridal party sat stacked on the dining table. Evidence of a celebration that would never happen, a future that had dissolved before it could begin. I changed out of the wedding dress, pulling on yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt that had belonged to Ethan. The realization made me freeze, the soft fabric suddenly feeling weighted with significance. This was his, from a weekend camping trip where I'd gotten cold and he'd insisted I take his hoodie. I'd never given it back, and he'd never asked for it. Such a small thing, but it spoke to the kind of relationship we'd built. Easy, generous, full of tiny moments of care. Claire ordered Thai food from our favorite place and opened a bottle of wine while we waited. We sat on my couch, the journal Catherine had given me resting on the coffee table between us like a live wire. Neither of us had touched it since we'd arrived, but its presence dominated the room. Are you going to read it? Claire asked, following my gaze. Eventually, I said. But not tonight. Tonight I think I've absorbed all the family trauma I can handle. Fair enough. She poured wine into 2 glasses and handed me one. So, do you want to talk about it or do you want me to put on something mindless and we can pretend today didn't happen? I took a long sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I want to talk about it. I need to talk about it, or I'm going to lose my mind. Okay. Claire tucked her legs under her and turned to face me fully. Then start wherever you need to start, and I'll listen. I stared into my wine glass, watching the liquid catch the lamplight. The thing that keeps circling in my head is how long he knew. 8 months, Claire. We got engaged, we planned this wedding, we told everyone we loved that we were building a life together, and the entire time he was carrying this massive secret. But can you understand why he didn't tell you right away? She asked gently, not defending him but genuinely asking. Logically, yes. He needed to be sure, needed to gather evidence, needed to understand what he was dealing with. And then once my mother found out and threatened him, telling me became about more than just our relationship. It became about exposing what they did to Anne. And emotionally? Can you understand it emotionally? That was the harder question. Emotionally, I felt betrayed. He'd made decisions about our relationship without giving me all the information, and that felt like a violation of the trust we'd built. But he'd also protected me from information that would have devastated me until he could present it in a way that was backed by undeniable proof. If he'd told me months ago without evidence, my family would have convinced me he was lying. They would have painted him as delusional or manipulative, and I probably would have believed them because I wasn't ready to see them clearly yet. I think, I said slowly, that he made the only choice he could make given the circumstances. I hate that he had to make it at all. I hate that my family put him in a position where keeping secrets felt necessary. But I don't think he did it to hurt me. Do you still love him? Claire's question was direct but kind. Yes, I admitted, and saying it out loud felt like both a relief and a burden. I love him. Maybe I shouldn't, given everything, but I do. The question is whether that's enough. Whether we can build something real on a foundation that started with lies, even if they were lies of omission told for complicated reasons. The food arrived, and we ate in companionable silence for a while. The familiar flavors of pad thai and green curry were grounding, reminding my body that it needed fuel even when my mind was spinning. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I'd turned off the sound but left it face up, and now notifications were stacking up like accusations. Mom, Dad, Dylan. A number I didn't recognize that was probably my mother calling from someone else's phone. And underneath all of those, a single message from Ethan that simply said, "I'm sorry. For everything. You deserved better than this." I set my phone face down and pushed it to the far end of the table. Not tonight. Whatever they had to say could wait until I had the strength to hear it. Claire and I ended up watching terrible reality television until nearly midnight, the kind of mindless drama that usually made us laugh at other people's problems. Tonight it just washed over me like white noise, filling the space so I didn't have to sit with my thoughts. When Claire finally headed home, promising to come back first thing in the morning, I was left alone with the silence and the journal. I picked it up, running my fingers over the worn leather cover. Inside these pages was a woman I'd never met, a story I'd never been told. Part of me wanted to rip it open and devour every word, to understand and Harper in all her complexity. But another part was terrified of what I'd find, of how much more painful this would become once she was real to me beyond just facts and photographs. In the end, I compromised. I opened the journal to a random page in the middle and let Anne's words find me. Ethan turned 3 today. We celebrated with a cupcake from the grocery store and a stuffed dinosaur I found at a thrift shop. He held that dinosaur like it was made of gold, told me it was the best present ever. I wanted to give him more, parties and toys and a house with a yard. But his joy over something so simple reminded me that love doesn't need money. He's happy because he's loved, and that's something Victoria's children will never truly have. Her kids will have everything except parents who love them for who they are instead of what they represent. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. And had known, even then, what kind of family I'd grow up in. She'd understood the conditional nature of Harper love, and she'd predicted that any children raised in that environment would suffer from it. She'd been right. I'd spent my whole life trying to be good enough, trying to earn love that should have been freely given, and it had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I flipped to another entry, this one dated 5 years later. Saw Mother at the farmer's market today. She looked right at me, and for just a second, I saw recognition in her eyes. Then she turned away like I was a ghost she refused to acknowledge. Ethan asked why that lady seemed mean, and I told him some people are just having a bad day. I don't know how to explain to an 8-year-old that his grandmother would rather pretend he doesn't exist than admit her daughter made choices she didn't approve of. How do you tell a child he's unwanted by people who should love him unconditionally? Tears blurred my vision as I read. This was my grandmother and was writing about the woman who died when I was 15. I'd mourned her loss, remembered her as elegant and dignified, someone who always smelled like roses and spoke in measured tones. But she'd been this too, cruel enough to look at her own daughter and grandchild and turn away. How many of my memories were built on foundations of lies? I closed the journal and set it aside, unable to read more without falling apart completely. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and did something I probably shouldn't have done while emotionally vulnerable. I started searching for Anne Harper, for any trace of her existence beyond my family's manufactured fiction. It didn't take long to find her obituary from last year. Anne Marie Chen, formerly Harper, died peacefully at Riverside Hospice after a brief illness. She was preceded in death by her parents and is survived by her son. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Young Parents Support Network. Services were private. Chen. She'd taken back her mother's maiden name, I realized. A way of reclaiming an identity separate from the Harpers who'd cast her out. And she'd asked for donations to go to an organization supporting young parents, using even her death as an opportunity to help people in situations like hers had been. I searched deeper, finding sparse mentions of her over the years. A few articles about community organizing in Eugene, where she'd volunteered with housing advocacy groups. A photograph from a local newspaper showing her at a food bank distribution, her smile tired but genuine. She'd lived a quiet life focused on service and survival, so different from the Harper obsession with status and appearance. Then I found something that made my breath catch. A video interview from 3 years ago, part of an oral history project about single mothers. The thumbnail showed Anne sitting in what looked like her living room, gray-haired and thin but with kind eyes that reminded me achingly of my own face in the mirror. I clicked play, and her voice filled my apartment. Soft, measured, with an accent that suggested years of making herself smaller to avoid attention. They asked her about advice for young mothers facing family rejection, and her answer was immediate. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of choosing love over approval. The people who truly matter will stand by you, and the ones who don't, well, their absence creates space for better relationships to grow. I won't lie and say it's easy. There were nights I cried myself to sleep wondering if I'd made the right choice. But my son is the best thing that ever happened to me, and I've never regretted putting his well-being above my family's expectations. The interviewer asked if she'd reconcile with her family if given the chance, and Anne's expression softened with sadness. I would have reconciled years ago if they'd been willing. But reconciliation requires both parties to acknowledge harm done and commit to doing better. My family has never been willing to admit they did anything wrong. They convinced themselves they were protecting the family name, protecting their reputation, and maybe in their minds, they were. But they destroyed a relationship with their daughter in the process, and that's not something I can forgive without genuine remorse and changed behavior. I paused the video, Anne's face frozen on the screen. She looked so much like my mother it was eerie, the same bone structure and eye shape. But where Victoria's expression was usually carefully controlled, calculated for effect, Anne's was open and honest. She lived a life where she couldn't afford pretense, where survival meant being authentic because the energy required for performance was a luxury she didn't have. My phone buzzed again, another notification I ignored. I returned to the video, watching the rest of Anne's interview. She spoke about working multiple jobs while Ethan was young, about the community of other single mothers who'd supported each other when their families wouldn't. About putting herself through night school to get a degree in social work so she could help others in similar situations. About the pride she felt watching her son become a teacher, choosing a profession focused on service rather than profit. Everything she said painted a picture of a woman who'd taken the rejection and pain of her youth and transformed it into compassion for others. She could have become bitter, could have spent her life angry at the family who'd abandoned her. Instead, she'd built a life focused on helping people her family would have deemed unworthy of their time. The video ended with the interviewer asking about regrets. And had smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face. My only regret is that my son grew up without extended family, without grandparents and cousins and the kind of support network that makes life easier. But we built our own family, chosen family made up of people who showed up when it mattered. And in some ways, that's more valuable than blood relations who are only there conditionally. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark silence of my apartment. And had died never knowing that I existed, never meeting the niece who could have loved her. My parents had stolen that relationship from both of us, and there was no way to get it back. The grief of that loss was staggering. But I was alive, and Ethan was alive, and there was still a chance to honor Anne's memory by refusing to repeat my family's mistakes. I didn't have to choose between loving Ethan and having a relationship with my parents. I could choose myself, choose a life built on authenticity rather than approval, choose to be the kind of family member and deserve to have had. The next morning arrived too quickly, pale light filtering through my curtains and birdsong I usually found cheerful feeling almost mocking. I'd barely slept, my mind replaying the wedding that wasn't, the revelations that were, the impossible situation I now found myself navigating. Claire arrived at 8 with coffee and bagels, taking one look at my face and wrapping me in a hug. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "Maybe 2 hours. I spent most of the night reading Anne's journal and watching videos of her online. Claire, she was remarkable. She went through hell and came out the other side focused on helping other people. Meanwhile, my family has had every advantage and used it to hurt people." "Your family made choices," Claire said firmly, handing me coffee. "You don't have to take responsibility for their actions. You only have to decide what choices you want to make now." We were halfway through breakfast when my phone rang. Not a text or a notification, but an actual call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost declined it, but something made me answer. "Miss Harper? This is Benjamin Reeves. I'm an attorney, and I represent your aunt and Harper's estate. I understand there was an incident at your wedding yesterday involving her son, Ethan Cross." "Word travels fast," I said, my stomach nodding. "What can I do for you?" "Actually, I'm calling because there's something you should know. Before and past, she left specific instructions in her will regarding you. She never met you, but she knew of your existence, and she wanted to make sure you received something after her death. Given recent events, I think it's time you knew about it." An hour later, I was sitting in Benjamin Reeves's office downtown, Claire beside me for moral support. The lawyer was older, with kind eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who dealt with family drama professionally. He slid a document across his desk, and I recognized Anne's handwriting on the attached note. "To my niece Natalie, if you're reading this, it means Ethan found the courage to tell you the truth about our family. I hope you can forgive him for carrying such a heavy burden. I wanted to meet you many times over the years, but I couldn't bring myself to disrupt your life when I didn't know if you'd even want to know me. This house in Eugene is paid off, small but sturdy. It's yours now if you want it. Not as an obligation, but as a choice. You always have a choice, even when your family tries to convince you otherwise. Love, Aunt Anne." The deed to a house sat beneath the note. I stared at it, this final gift from a woman who'd thought of me even in death, who'd wanted to give me something my family never had, freedom without strings attached. "She bought this place 10 years ago," Mr. Reeves explained. "Used every penny of her savings and worked extra shifts for years to pay off the mortgage early. She told me once it was important to her that you'd have somewhere to go if you ever needed to escape." Her words, not mine. I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. And had spent her final years thinking of me, planning for a future where I might need exactly what she'd needed 3 decades ago. A safe place to land when family love came with too high a price. "There's more," Mr. Reeves continued gently. "She left letters, dozens of them. One for every birthday you've had since she was cast out. She wrote them but never sent them, not wanting to cause problems between you and your parents. But she wanted you to have them now, to know she'd been thinking of you all along." He handed me a box, and when I opened it, I saw envelopes marked with dates spanning my entire life. My first birthday, my 10th, my 16th, my 21st. Each one sealed and waiting, a relationship that existed only in Anne's heart and on these pages. "I need to see Ethan," I said suddenly, standing up with the box clutched to my chest. "I need to see him right now." Claire drove me to his apartment, the box of letters' precious cargo between us. When Ethan opened the door, he looked like he hadn't slept either, his hair disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed. The sight of me on his doorstep clearly shocked him. "Natalie," he started, but I cut him off. "Your mother left me her house. And letters. She'd been writing to me for 28 years even though we never met." His face crumpled, and suddenly we were both crying, holding each other in his doorway while Claire quietly slipped away to give us privacy. We eventually made it inside, sitting on his couch surrounded by Anne's letters, reading them together. She documented my life from afar, celebrated milestones she'd learned about through careful research, offered advice for struggles she'd imagined I might face. In the letter marked for my 16th birthday, she wrote about choosing authenticity over acceptance. On my 21st, she wrote about the difference between family you're born into and family you choose. And in the final letter, dated just weeks before she died, she wrote something that made both Ethan and I sob. "Natalie, I hope by now you know the truth about what happened to me, and I hope it helps you understand that you're not required to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold you. Love Ethan if you choose to, not despite the connection between you but because of it. We share blood that survived rejection and poverty and loss. That's something to honor, not hide from. Build the life you want, not the life others expect. That's the only legacy that matters." We sat in silence after reading the last letter, the weight of Anne's love settling around us like a blanket. Finally, I spoke. "I don't know if I can marry you," I said honestly. "Not right now, when everything is so raw and complicated. But I don't want to lose you either. Can we start over? Really start over, with all the truth on the table this time?" Ethan nodded, hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. "We can take as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere." 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of Anne's house, mine now, painting the walls a soft yellow while Ethan assembled bookshelves in what would become his home office. We weren't married, but we were building something stronger than a wedding could have given us. We were building trust, slowly and carefully, with honesty as our foundation. My parents had tried calling for weeks after the wedding. I'd eventually answered and told them I needed space, that I'd reach out when I was ready. Dylan had sent angry texts that I'd blocked. But surprisingly, my father had shown up at Anne's house one rainy afternoon, standing on the porch looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "I'm sorry," he'd said simply. "For all of it. Your mother and I, we convinced ourselves we were doing the right thing, but we were just scared. Scared of judgment, of losing control, of admitting we'd made terrible mistakes." We'd talked for hours that day, and while it didn't fix everything, it was a beginning. He'd asked to read Anne's journals, to understand the sister-in-law he'd helped erase, and I'd let him. Whether he could truly change remained to be seen, but he was trying, and that was more than I'd expected. As the sun set through the windows of Anne's house, my house, Ethan came to stand beside me. We looked out at the garden and had planted wild roses and lavender that had survived her death and now bloomed for us. "She would have liked this," he said softly. "You being here, us figuring it out together." I leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. We were writing a different ending than the one my family had scripted, honoring Anne's memory by refusing to let fear and appearances dictate our choices. It wasn't the wedding I'd planned, but it was something better. It was real. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.